folks. So I should be live on YouTube, and as things go, I'm trying to also go live on 2 other platforms, and they seem to be working. So let's get it started. All right. Yay. All right, folks. So I have to say that this live stream is all about the fact that it is not just us. Colorism does not just happen among our own people, okay? One of the most common misunderstandings of colorism is that people believe, oh, it's only within the Black race, or it's only within the Indian race, or it's only amongst people of color. And so this myth or this misunderstanding is one of the main reasons that people think colorism is a less important issue, or they're able to think that it doesn't go beyond our communities into the larger society. And so a lot of people who say, oh, we don't need to worry about that. We need to focus primarily on racism and, like white supremacy and or things like that. It's because sometimes they really think that colorism is limited to just a Black person to Black person thing, or an Asian person to Asian person thing. But the reality is that we are just as likely to experience colorism from other communities as we are to experience racism from other communities. All right. And I often say, and it bears repeating, so I will say it until I think the world really understands it. A lot of the things we attribute to racism could be better understood through the lens of colorism. And if you're just tuning in, this is your first time joining one of my lives, welcome. Feel free to say hello in the chat. I will be saving time towards the end for questions or comments, so you're free to respond, engage along the way. I am Dr. Sarah Webb, the founder of Colorism Healing, which is a global leader in raising awareness, shifting attitudes, and taking action to address colorism around the globe. And I provide public speaking, professional training, corporate consulting to people who are ready to advance their equity missions. And this live is part of a long series that I started this year based on my PDF/ebook called Corporate Colorism and Why Business Leaders Must Upgrade Their Anti-Racist Strategies. So if you want to read along, or if you want to read the things that I'm talking about, you can download the PDF for free. Or if you want to purchase the ebook off Amazon, you can do that as well. So I am thinking about, on this episode, 2 types of colorism, right? And those 2 types of colorism are called intra-racial colorism and interracial colorism. I also did a live stream about this close to a year ago. So if you've already seen that video in the past, this could be a refresher for you, but I'm sure a lot of people, this is your first time engaging with me on this topic. All right, so let's jump back into the content. I want to define these 2 things. And if you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, you should be able to see the slides that I'm about to put up on my screen here. But if you're on Instagram, I'll just have to describe it to you. So the first type of colorism, the one that we're all familiar with, the one we're most often used to talking about, is intra-racial colorism. That's INTRA, racial colorism. So that's the colorism that does happen amongst people of the same race, right? So amongst African-American families, or amongst an African-American community, or amongst a Hispanic community or Asian community. And then there's the other type of colorism, one that people don't acknowledge or that people tend to ignore or dismiss, which is interracial colorism. That's INTER, racial colorism. So that means that me of one race, I could perpetuate colorism towards someone who's a different race than I am. Okay? That's super, super important to understand. And so people don't just place greater value on lighter skinned people of their own race, but they're placing greater value on lighter skinned people of all races. Now, to clarify, this doesn't necessarily mean that they would prefer a lighter skinned person from a different race than they would prefer someone of their race. But if they're speaking to or engaging with a group of people of a different race, they will treat the lighter skinned individuals more favorably. And so here are some examples of that. And I'm still showing some slides on the screen if you're on YouTube or LinkedIn. I think it's showing up on LinkedIn. Is it showing up on LinkedIn? Yes. Okay. So one example would be if a white employer assumes that light-skinned Black American or light-skinned Latinx people or light-skinned Asian people or job applicants are more intelligent and more professional than dark-skinned Black American, Latinx, or Asian job candidates, right? And there's research to show that that actually happens. Another example of interracial colorism might be if an Asian teacher penalizes dark-skinned Black students more harshly than their light-skinned Black students. This is also something that we see happening. And then a third example of this interracial colorism might be if African American police officers assume that dark-skinned Latinx people are more likely to be criminals, quote unquote, than light-skinned or European Latinx people. And so that's important because the reason that people misunderstand the scope and the impact of colorism as something that has systemic inequalities, something that creates structural disparities on a mass scale, is because they think that it's just happening within a racial group. And that's why that's often the argument for why it's quote unquote less important than racism. Why people tend to prioritize something like racism over colorism is because they think racism is what, white colonizers have done and continue to do to people across the globe. But white people are just as likely to be colorists amongst their own people and amongst everyone else than as, Black people are towards other Black people. And so once you acknowledge the interracial colorism, the fact that no matter what race you are, you can still prefer light-skinned people of all races. And you could still stigmatize dark-skinned people of every other race. Another example of this is if you were doing a casting call, right? And a lot of times we talk about colorism in Hollywood. And I had this quick tangent. When I start to talk about the entertainment industry, people who talk about business and employment, they think that that's sort of trivial, but the entertainment industry is a workplace, right? So that's still a job for a lot of people, right? That's still their workplace. And so when we think about casting calls, for example, a lot of times, the Straight Outta Compton casting call is a great example. There was a casting firm that was perpetuating colorism in their casting call, saying that we want the light-skinned girls or girls with like naturally straight hair, girls who are thin to be the A girls or the preferred girls, and stigmatizing girls with darker skin tones or more Afro-textured hair and larger bodies. And that casting call, even though they were casting, Black girls and other people of color, they were not themselves Black. And yet they were still enforcing that hierarchy amongst African American actresses. And so that hierarchy can be enforced within a race, but also across races. So from one race to another racial group. Once we have this understanding, then we can kind of understand how there is income inequality amongst people of the same race. Then we can understand why there's differences in educational attainment amongst people of the same race. Then we understand why there's inequality in sentencing, prison sentencing for African Americans, and why if you're lighter skinned, you get a lighter prison sentence, right? Pun intended. Because whether the judge is Black, whether the judge is Asian, whether that judge is white, they perceive lighter-skinned Black people as more innocent, as being less criminal, as being more approachable, and darker-skinned Black people, they are perceived as being more threatening or being more deviant, are more likely to be criminal. Again, regardless of the race of the judge or the jury, right? All right, so now I'm ready for Q&A. So I saw a lot of comments coming in on LinkedIn, and I can close my notes now so I can see all three screens. I have three screens now, y'all. But if you are just tuning in, I have just explained the difference between interracial colorism and intraracial colorism. A lot of people know that colorism happens amongst people of the same race, but not as many people know that colorism can also happen across racial groups. So yes, white people can perpetuate colorism. I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings that people have is they think white folks just see us as all the same. And that is not true. White folks do not just see all black people as the same. They do place greater value on the black people who more closely resemble or align to their idea of whiteness. Okay. Now let's look at your questions. If you have any, let me go back to the chat on YouTube. All right. YouTube is kind of quiet, but I see some folks watching there. Hey. Hey, LinkedIn. Yes, I see some of my usual crew in here. Aya, welcome. Michael, hey y'all. I just did a live with both of you on Saturday, so good to see you. Hi, Jamila, good to see you back again. Trevera, Worthy, Kurtz W. Jackson, hey y'all. Elsa Bueno, Keith B, I see some new names. Says, Aya says shifting attitudes and taking action. That's what's up. Yeah, I think there's a slight delay too, so I'm gonna let y'all catch up with me. Hey, Instagram. I haven't been showing y'all any love. Any questions or comments from the Instagram crew? Says Cynthia Small says, are there any books you recommend reading about this topic? Well, I think Don't Play in the Sun by Marita Golden. Golden is an accessible introduction to this concept of colorism because it includes research, but it also has more of a narrative feel. It almost reads like a memoir, but it's kind of like an academic memoir almost. So that's a good one. And then another one would be Skin Color Matters. And I think that was written by Kimberly Norwood. Last name is definitely Norwood. But more broadly speaking, if you visit colorismhealing.com, I have an entire index of resources that you can use to research. Some of them are books, some of them are articles, some of them are other organizations that do work around colorism. So that is an invaluable resource for anyone who really, really wants to dive deep. And of course, there's the ebook/PDF corporate colorism if you want to look specifically at colorism in the workplace, which you can also download for free as a PDF at colorismhealing.com. I'm plugging my website because I worked really hard to make it a really valuable resource for everyone. STMC says, would those examples work in reverse, where an organization may choose darker complexions in a way to appeal more woke to their audience? So I can see that being an instance where they would choose darker skinned people to give off a certain perception, right? But when we talk about colorism, the hierarchy does not work in reverse. And so I would refer you to my last few episodes, actually, if you want to go deeper into why colorism doesn't work in reverse. Because at the core of colorism, the essence of colorism, the foundation of colorism is that there's greater value, that people with lighter skin tones are inherently more valuable, are inherently better, are inherently more intelligent, are inherently more sophisticated, are professional than people with darker skin tones, right? And in many ways, if we want to cut to the chase, the lighter, whiter your skin tone, the straighter your hair, the more Eurocentric you look, you're also seen as more human. Right. And I don't have time on this live stream to go back to the pseudoscience of the, colonial days, but there was greater humanity placed on and afforded to people with more European phenotypes and ancestry. And so even if people are choosing or preferring dark-skinned people over light-skinned people in one instance, it's not reversing the system. In many ways, it's a reaction to the system, or it's a way to mitigate the consequences of the system, right? And so we think about affirmative action. A lot of people say that's reverse racism, or they say that affirmative action is reverse sexism, right? Choosing to hire women over men, or choosing to hire, people of color over white people to, balance the scales, or, quote unquote, level the playing field. And so even if people are saying, well, we're going to cast dark-skinned people because we want to portray this certain image, I wouldn't use reverse. It's not a reversal of the system. The second thing about that is then it becomes tokenism, which is just as problematic, right? And so saying that we're choosing darker skinned people to give an appearance that we are one way when we really aren't that way is a hollow attempt at doing equity and inclusion work, right? Because it's representation is a piece of equity and inclusion, but it's not all that matters, right? Are there actual structural changes? When you do cast those people, when you do hire those darker skinned people, are they able to thrive in that environment? Do you have, especially in a casting call, do you have people that can do their makeup? Do you have people that can do their hair? If you cast those people, are they cast in stereotypical roles, or do they get to be the leading lady or have the leading role? Are they given full autonomy and agency in those settings, right? So it has to go far beyond that. And oftentimes, if a company or if an agency is casting dark-skinned people merely to appear woke, then the chances that they actually treat those people fairly and that they actually create an environment where those people can thrive is highly unlikely. All right, great question. Any other questions? STMC says, I write this with assumption that majority of deciders are white. In many spaces, yes, but it also happens even when the deciders are other people of color, like the Straight Outta Compton casting call. That agency, I don't think the casting directors or the owners of the agency are not white, right? They are not considered white. Now, whether or not they were using other people in their agency to do the actual casting, but the owners of the agency themselves were not white. Aya, thank you for being so active in the chat. Says, wow, how sad. Someone was telling me on LinkedIn that someone else was arguing with them, saying that Black people are different from everyone else and are less than. Yeah, so anti-Blackness in terms of colorism is, I think, has to be part of the conversation always as well. Because what we'll have other racial groups talking about colorism in their communities, but they aren't willing to confront their bias and their prejudice against Black people specifically, right? And so when we look at, let's say, for example, an Asian person being anti-Black towards a light-skinned Black person, right? They still are going to prefer that light-skinned Black person over a dark-skinned Black person. And I think that's where the confusion comes in, right? Because lighter-skinned Black people will say, I still experience racism. I still experience hate from these other races or these other racial groups. And that is true, right? If you are a light-skinned Black person, you will still experience racism from other groups. But darker-skinned Black people will experience even harsher, greater degrees, and more frequent racism from those other groups. And so that's how the colorism plays out in that dynamic. All right. So no questions today. So I'm going to wrap up with the live, folks. This was pretty quick. Okay. Something just came in on YouTube. So let's see what this is on YouTube from day 5. Dr. Webb, how can we respectfully let light-skinned people that may have been bullied understand the difference between maybe that they are bullied and not experiencing colorism? Great question, day 5. So this is a very, very common question, something that I have to explain very often. In saying that, I have done other extended videos on why colorism doesn't go in reverse and why there's no such thing as reverse colorism. But to answer your question here and now on the live, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how colorism is based on the perceived superiority of people with lighter skin tones and the perceived or believed inferiority of people with darker skin tones. And so being bullied, a lot of light-skinned people who are bullied, that's not coming from a place of, oh, we think light-skinned people are inferior to us, or we think light-skinned people are less human than us, right? Oftentimes it's interpersonal conflict. Oftentimes it's the individual relationship dynamics themselves that might give rise to that bullying or that teasing. And sometimes it is a response to the system of colorism in which light-skinned people benefit from the oppression of darker-skinned people. And so if we think about colorism as a systemic issue and a structural issue where darker skinned people are more stigmatized, experience more racism, are discriminated against at higher rates in the job market, in the healthcare system, in the legal system, then no amount of bullying or teasing is reversing or toppling that system. And so even if someone is mean to a light-skinned person, that light-skinned person still retains all of those social privileges and all of that social capital that comes from being light-skinned in a society that places greater value on light-skinned people. The other thing I'll say too is that even if a light-skinned person is bullied, they can still look at every billboard, turn on the TV, open up a magazine, and be affirmed and receive messages and narratives about their worth relative to darker skinned people. Whereas if a dark skinned person is bullied, they're going to have that negative narrative, that stigma reinforced everywhere they look, right? And so the system really supports and reinforces the bullying and the teasing and the discrimination against dark skinned people. Whereas if a light skinned person is bullied or teased, that is not corroborated or reinforced or supported in the larger society in which they are actually placed in a higher advantage. Great question, day 5. I hope my response was a clear one. Cynthia Smalls. Hey, cool kid Sam. Yeah, anti-blackness is what it is. And can you post your Cash App or Venmo or money for donation stuff? Yes, I'm at Colorism Healing on Venmo and Cash App sign Colorism Healing on Cash App. Any, support is welcome. Cynthia Small says, thank you for sharing this information. This has really helped me hold space for the trauma experienced from family and people within my race around my color. You are more than welcome, Cynthia Smalls. All right, folks, so let me recap and wrap up. I don't see any other questions coming in. So for those who are tuning in late, maybe you're just joining the live stream, definitely go back and watch the replay. This video will be saved on YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And it's been about the fact that colorism is not just us. It's not just an us thing. It's not just a Black people thing. It's not just a people of color thing, but that every race perpetuates colorism within and across races. And that's important to understand because it helps us recognize colorism as a systemic problem. Because as long as we think colorism is just happening in your family or just happening amongst people who look like you, then it's hard to make the leap into understanding that there are disparities and inequalities that are systemic and system-wide, structural inequalities in terms of outcomes and life opportunities and access to resources that people have based on their skin tone. And so homework, y'all know I love giving homework, but I'm feeling benevolent as a professor today. And so I'm not giving you any homework. You get a week of no homework. Obviously, always study, freshen up your knowledge on colorism, listen to the archives. But your affirmation for today is I open my mind to new insights and I give myself permission to change my perspective. And so I appreciate all of you. Every week, whether you just watch this one time or whether you are a loyal listener and you tune in at noon every Monday, I appreciate the fact that y'all are opening your minds to talking about colorism. You're opening your minds to getting in new information, learning about new research, learning about new books or documentaries that you can read, and giving yourself permission to evolve your thinking on this topic, right? And so next week, join me again, same place, same time, noon Central Time on Mondays. And next week is going to be really juicy because we're looking at the historical roots of colorism. Y'all, every time I talk about colorism, people want to know, how did we get here? Why is this a thing? Where did this come from? How did it start? And so next week, I'm going to be diving into those historical roots. But until then, I hope you all have a beautiful week ahead. Your company means so much to me. Much love. I'll see y'all next week. I'm just looking at Michael's comment. Michael says, no homework, but still you better work. Absolutely. Bye, y'all.